close your eyes and drift back through time to the 1700s, a century of discovery, enlightenment, and quiet revolutions that reshaped civilization. As the century opened, the world's population stood at around 600 million people, less than a tenth of today. Imagine a planet far more sparsely inhabited, where vast wilderness remained untouched. In England around 1709, Abraham Darby discovered how to smelt iron using coke instead of charcoal. For the first time, iron could be produced massively without depleting forests. This innovation became a foundation of the Industrial Revolution, allowing humanity to build stronger bridges, better tools, and transformative machines. The 1700s saw global trade expand dramatically. Ships crossed oceans carrying tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, textiles from India, and manufactured goods from Europe. By mid-century, international trade had increased more than threefold. The world was becoming interconnected through commerce. Picture the coffee houses of London, Paris, Amsterdam, the internet of their age. In these aromatic gathering places, philosophers debated, scientists shared discoveries, and merchants conducted business. Coffee houses became centers of intellectual exchange, spreading Enlightenment ideas. In 1714, Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit perfected the mercury thermometer. Before this, measuring temperature was unreliable. Fahrenheit's standardized scale allowed scientists worldwide to communicate findings with precision. Humanity's growing ability to measure and understand the natural world. Consider medicine in the early 1700s. Life was fragile. But in 1721 in Boston, something remarkable happened. During a smallpox outbreak, inoculation was introduced through knowledge shared by an enslaved man named one Zymus with cotton mather. This early immunization was controversial but worked. Humanity's first successful attempt to prevent disease rather than simply treat it. In 1735, Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus published Systema Naturae, introducing binomial nomenclature for classifying organisms. His two-part Latin naming system brought order to chaos, allowing scientists across continents to communicate precisely about the same species. This elegant system is still used today. Breathe deeply and drift to the 1750s. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent D'Alembert created the encyclopedia, collecting all human knowledge into one work. The first volume appeared in 1751. Eventually, 28 volumes were published. This radical statement suggested knowledge should be accessible, that reason mattered more than authority, inspiring people to question and seek understanding. Agriculture was also transforming. England's agricultural revolution brought crop rotation systems, selective breeding of livestock, and tools like Jethro Tull's seed drill. These innovations meant fewer farmers could feed more people, freeing others for factory work. Famines became less common and populations grew. In Scotland in the 1760s, James Watt improved the steam engine. His separate condenser, patented in 1769, made it far more powerful. Steam engines would pump water from mines, power textile mills, and drive trains and ships. Humanity harnessing energy to do work requiring hundreds of horses or thousands of workers. The 1700s were a century when humanity woke up to its potential to measure precisely, classify nature's wonders, prevent disease, connect across oceans, share knowledge widely, feed populations efficiently, and harness steam and iron. It was a century of quiet revolutions. Rest now and let these images carry you gently towards sleep, knowing 90 more stories await. For now, just breathe and drift as the 1700s continue to unfold. Johann Sebastian Bach, working in Leipzig during the 1720s and 1730s, composed his Brandenburg concertos, the Mass in B minor, and hundreds of cantatas. During his lifetime, Bach was known primarily as an organist. His musical genius was only recognized generations later. While the world rushed forward, Bach crafted something timeless, mathematical yet deeply emotional, music that still moves us centuries later. The British colonies in North America grew dramatically, from about 250,000 in 1700 to approximately 2.5 million by 1775, a tenfold increase. Families pushed westward, clearing forests, establishing farms. Native American populations faced devastating losses from disease and conflict. This demographic transformation was one of history's great migrations, setting changes in motion that will reverberate through centuries. In 1752 in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin conducted his famous kite experiment, demonstrating that lightning was electrical. His understanding led him to invent the lightning rod, saving countless buildings from fire. It represented the Enlightenment ideal perfectly. Through observation and experiment, humans could understand nature and use that knowledge for practical benefit. In 1719, Daniel Defoe published Robinson Crusoe, often considered the first English novel. It featured an ordinary person, not a noble hero, written in plain, accessible language. The novel democratized literature, making storytelling accessible to the growing, increasingly literate middle classes. Throughout the century, the form flourished with works like Gulliver's Travels and Candide. By 1765, industrialization was creating unprecedented wealth, but with costs. Factory work was brutal, long hours, dangerous conditions, child labor. Industrial cities brought overcrowding, pollution, and poverty alongside prosperity. The 1700s showed us that progress and consequences are forever intertwined. In 1735, the French Academy of Sciences sent expeditions to Peru and Lapland to measure latitude at different locations. These measurements proved Earth is slightly flattened at the poles, an oblate spheroid. Newton had predicted this. Now it was confirmed through painstaking observation, representing international scientific cooperation and humanity's growing precision. Sugar consumption in Britain increased dramatically, transforming from luxury to commonplace commodity. But this sweetness had a bitter foundation. Sugar plantations relied on enslaved African labor. The triangular trade connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas brought enormous wealth to some while causing immeasurable suffering to millions. In 1748, Montesquieu published The Spirit of the Laws, arguing for separation of governmental powers into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. This idea would be incorporated into the American Constitution. He believed dividing power protected liberty by preventing any single authority from becoming tyrannical. In 1762, the first numbered houses appeared on London streets, making navigation and mail delivery efficient. Before this, addresses were given by landmarks. This rationalization of urban space was part of a broader trend toward standardization in everything from house numbers to scientific measurements. In 1776, Adam Smith released The Wealth of Nations, laying foundations of modern economics. He argued that individuals pursuing self-interest could benefit society through the market's invisible hand. Smith gave us a vocabulary and framework for thinking about economics still used today. The 1700s were a century when humans began thinking differently about themselves, their societies, and their place in the universe. 20 facts now weave together as you drift toward sleep, with 80 more waiting. Travel with me now to the year 1714, to the problem that had vexed sailors for centuries. When a ship left port and sailed across the ocean, determining latitude, how far north or south you were, was relatively simple. You could measure the angle of the sun or stars. But longitude, how far east or west you had traveled, was nearly impossible to calculate accurately. Ships would become hopelessly lost, running aground or missing their destinations by hundreds of miles. Thousands of sailors died because of this problem. In 1714, the British government offered the Longitude Prize, a massive reward for anyone who could solve this challenge. A clockmaker named John Harrison spent decades working on the solution. By the 1760s, he had created a marine chronometer, a clock so accurate that it could keep precise time even aboard a rolling ship. With this device, sailors could calculate their longitude by comparing local time to the time at a reference point. This invention made global navigation reliable for the first time, opening the oceans to safer trade and exploration. The world became navigable, measurable, knowable. As you relax into this rhythm of discovery, let us turn our attention to medicine once more. In 1796, near the end of the century, Edward Jenner performed an experiment that would save countless millions of lives. He had observed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox, a mild disease, seemed immune to the deadly smallpox. Jenner took material from a cowpox blister and inoculated a young boy with it. Later, he exposed the boy to smallpox, and remarkably, the boy did not fall ill. This was vaccination, different from the earlier inoculation practice, using a mild disease to protect against a deadly one. Jenner's work would eventually lead to smallpox becoming the first disease humanity ever completely eradicated. In the 1700s, smallpox killed hundreds of thousands every year. It scarred and blinded countless others. Jenner's insight, built on careful observation and a willingness to test his hypothesis, showed that humans could actively defeat diseases that plagued them since the dawn of civilization. Drift now to the workshops and factories of England, where a transformation in how things were made was quietly revolutionizing daily life. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a device that allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at once. Initially 8 spindles, eventually more than 100. Before this, spinning thread was painstakingly slow work, with one person working one spindle. The spinning jenny multiplied productivity enormously. Soon after, other inventions followed. Richard Arkwright's water frame, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule. These machines transformed textile production from a cottage industry done in homes to a factory enterprise. The textile industry was the leading edge of the Industrial Revolution, and by the end of the century, Britain was producing cotton cloth on a scale that would have been unimaginable at the century's beginning. Cloth became cheaper, more people could afford it, but the nature of work itself was changing, from independent craftspeople to factory workers operating machines. Let your mind wander now to the realm of chemistry, still emerging as a true science in the 1700s. For centuries, people had believed that when something burned, it released a substance called phlogiston. But in the 1770s, several scientists were conducting experiments that would overturn this theory. Antoine Lavoisier in France demonstrated that combustion was actually a chemical reaction with oxygen. He carefully weighed substances before and after burning them, showing that matter was neither created nor destroyed, merely transformed. Lavoisier is often called the father of modern chemistry because he introduced rigor, measurement, and systematic naming to the field. He helped establish chemistry as a quantitative science. His work represented the Enlightenment ideal. Careful observation and measurement could reveal the true nature of reality, replacing ancient theories with demonstrated facts. Now, picture the year 1768. The planet Venus was scheduled to pass between Earth and the Sun, an astronomical event called a transit, which would not happen again for over a century. Scientists around the world recognized that by observing this transit from different locations, they could calculate the distance between Earth and the Sun with unprecedented accuracy. The British Royal Society organized expeditions to various points around the globe to observe this phenomenon. One of these expeditions was led by Captain James Cook, who sailed to Tahiti. After successfully observing the transit, Cook went on to chart New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, mapping territories that had been unknown to Europeans. These voyages represented the intersection of science and exploration, the desire to understand the cosmos driving humans to the farthest reaches of the planet. The transit of Venus observations helped humanity comprehend the true scale of the solar system, our tiny place in the vast expanse of space. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax even more deeply, consider the political transformations occurring in this century. In 1789, the French Revolution began, an upheaval that would reshape not just France, but the entire world's understanding of government and society. The revolutionaries proclaimed principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They challenged the divine right of kings, the privileges of nobility, the power of the church. The French Revolution was partly inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the recent American Revolution. It showed that centuries-old social orders could be completely overturned, that common people could claim political power. Though the revolution would descend into violence and eventually lead to Napoleon's empire, its ideals would echo through the centuries that followed, inspiring democratic movements worldwide. The world learned that change was possible, that societies could be remade according to new principles. Let us turn now to the world of exploration within our own bodies. In 1761, an Italian anatomist named Giovanni Morgani published On the Seats and Causes of Diseases, based on hundreds of autopsies he had performed. Morgani correlated the symptoms patients showed during life with the physical abnormalities he found in their organs after death. This might sound morbid, but it was revolutionary. Before Morgani, medicine was largely based on ancient theories about bodily humors and abstract concepts. Morgani helped establish pathological anatomy, the understanding that diseases have specific physical causes in specific organs. If a patient died with breathing difficulties, Morgani might find damaged lungs. This correlation between symptoms and physical changes made medicine more scientific, more precise. It was another step in humanity's journey from superstition towards systematic understanding of the natural world, including our own bodies. Picture now the great libraries and universities of Europe in the mid-1700s. Education was changing, becoming more accessible to those beyond the aristocracy. By 1750, Literacy rates in England and parts of Western Europe had risen significantly. Perhaps 60% of men and 40% of women could read, compared to much lower rates a century earlier. The printing press, now more than 2 centuries old, had made books progressively cheaper. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated widely, spreading news and ideas. Coffee houses and salons became places where people of different classes could discuss philosophy, politics, and science. This expansion of literacy and access to information created a more educated populace, one capable of questioning authority and demanding change. The spread of knowledge itself became a force for transformation in the 1700s, enabling the revolutions in thought and politics that characterize the age. As this segment of our journey through time draws toward its close, let us reflect on the changing relationship between humans and the natural world. In 1735, the same year Linnaeus published his classification system, there was growing interest in natural history. Collecting, cataloging, and studying plants, animals, and minerals. Wealthy individuals created cabinets of curiosities, filled with specimens from around the world. Botanical gardens were established in major cities. Explorers brought back new species from distant lands. This wasn't just idle curiosity. It represented humanity's systematic effort to document Earth's biodiversity. People were beginning to see the natural world not merely as resources to exploit or dangers to fear, but as a complex system worthy of study and wonder. This shift in perspective, this sense that nature had inherent interest and value, was part of the broader Enlightenment transformation in how humans understood their world. And finally, consider the technological innovation that would eventually change human life as much as any invention in history: the flush toilet. While primitive water closets had existed earlier, in 1775, Alexander Cumming patented an improved design with an S-trap that used water to seal off sewer gases, the basic principle still used today. Around the same time, others like Joseph Bramah were making further improvements. These inventions might seem mundane, but they were part of a crucial development: improved sanitation. Throughout most of history, cities were filthy places where disease spread rapidly. The improvements in plumbing and sanitation that began in the 1700s, though they wouldn't reach full fruition until the next century, would dramatically reduce the spread of cholera, typhoid, and other diseases. Sometimes the inventions that most improve human life are not the grand or glamorous ones, but those that address basic human needs with clever engineering. Let's begin by considering the written word and its power to change minds. In 1776, the same year that saw both American independence and Adam Smith's economic treatise, another powerful piece of writing emerged. Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a pamphlet that argued forcefully for American independence from Britain. What made it remarkable was not just its arguments, but its style and reach. Paine wrote in clear, accessible language that ordinary people could understand, not the formal, classical style of most political writing. Common Sense sold an estimated 500,000 copies in the American colonies, whose total population was only about 2.5 million. Nearly everyone encountered these ideas, discussed them, debated them. It showed that political writing could reach and persuade the masses, that ideas could spread like wildfire through print. The power of the press to shape political change became undeniably clear in the 1700s. Drift would mean now to the concert halls and opera houses of Europe. In 1786, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart premiered his opera The Marriage of Figaro in Vienna. Mozart was creating music of extraordinary sophistication and emotional depth, symphonies, concertos, operas, chamber music. But here's what's fascinating about Mozart in the 1700s. He represented a shift in how artists related to society. Earlier composers like Bach had worked for the church or nobility, creating music on commission. Mozart, especially in his later years, tried to work as a freelance artist, supporting himself through public concerts and published compositions. This was a new model, the artist as an independent professional serving a public audience rather than a wealthy patron. It reflected broader changes in society. The rise of a middle class with money and leisure for cultural pursuits, the emergence of public concert halls and theaters, the commercialization of art. Culture itself was becoming more democratic, more accessible. Now, let your thoughts travel to the world of exploration and natural science. In 1735, French naturalist Charles Marie de la Condamine joined one of those expeditions to Peru to measure Earth's shape. But he did something else remarkable during his time in South America. He observed and documented the indigenous people's use of rubber from trees. He brought samples back to Europe, introducing the Western world to this curious material that was elastic and waterproof. It would be decades before rubber's full potential was realized, but La Condamine's observations were the beginning. This pattern repeated throughout the 1700s. European explorers encountered materials, plants, and knowledge from indigenous peoples around the world. Quinine from South America, various agricultural crops, medicinal plants. Much of what we consider scientific discovery in the 1700s was actually the documentation and appropriation of knowledge that indigenous peoples had possessed for centuries. As you relax more deeply, picture the changing soundscape of cities in the 1700s. In 1709, Bartolomeo Cristofori in Italy invented the pianoforte, which we now simply call the piano. Unlike the harpsichord, which preceded it, the piano could play both soft and loud notes depending on how hard the keys were struck. That's what pianoforte means, soft loud. This might seem like a small change, but it transformed music. Composers could now write pieces with dramatic dynamic contrasts, with gentle whispers building to thunderous crescendos. The piano will become the dominant keyboard instrument, the centerpiece of countless homes in the centuries to come. In the 1700s, it was a new voice added to humanity's musical palette, expanding the range of expression available to composers and performers. Let us turn now to the study of the past itself. In 1748, something extraordinary happened in southern Italy. Workers digging a well near Naples accidentally rediscovered the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, which had been buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. The systematic excavation of Pompeii, which began in earnest in the 1760s, revealed an entire ancient city preserved in volcanic ash, homes with furniture still in place, wall paintings bright with color, even loaves of bread carbonized but intact. This discovery revolutionized the study of ancient history and sparked a passionate interest in classical antiquity across Europe. It showed that the past was not just words in old books, but physical reality that could be uncovered and studied. Archaeology as a discipline was born from discoveries like Pompeii, giving humanity a new way to understand where we came from. Picture now the year 1762, and consider a philosophical work that challenged everything about how society educated its young. Jean-Jacques Rousseau published Emile or on Education, arguing that children should be allowed to develop naturally learning through experience and exploration rather than through strict discipline and rote memorization. Rousseau believed that humans were born good and were corrupted by society. His ideas about education, emphasizing nature, freedom, and the child's innate curiosity, were radical for their time. While controversial and imperfectly realized, these ideas would influence educational philosophy for centuries to come. The 1700s saw thinkers questioning not just government and science, but even the fundamental ways humans raise and taught their children. Drift now to the practical innovations that change daily life in subtle but meaningful ways. In 1752, a Swedish astronomer named Anders Celsius proposed a temperature scale based on the freezing and boiling points of water, 0 degrees for freezing, 100 degrees for boiling. This Celsius scale, originally inverted, then flipped to its current form, provided an intuitive decimal base system for measuring temperature. Alongside Fahrenheit's earlier scale, it represented humanity's increasing ability to standardize measurements. Throughout the 1700s, scientists worked toward common systems of measurement, recognizing that progress required precise communication. These standardizations might seem dry and technical, but they were essential infrastructure for the scientific revolution, allowing researchers across different countries to share and verify each other's work. As you breathe slowly and deeply, let us consider the global movement of people and the terrible human cost that accompanied much of the century's economic growth. During the 1700s, it is estimated that over 6 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, the majority of the entire transatlantic slave trade's duration. This massive, brutal displacement of people powered the plantation economies of the Americas, producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other commodities that fed into global trade networks. The wealth generated by enslaved labor funded much of Europe's economic development and enriched merchants and plantation owners. Resistance took many forms, from day-to-day acts of defiance to organized rebellions. The 1700s saw several significant slave revolts, and the century's end brought the beginnings of the abolitionist movement, with people on both sides of the Atlantic beginning to organize against this inhumane system. The story of the 1700s cannot be told honestly without acknowledging this profound injustice at the heart of the century's economic transformation. Now let your mind wander to the study of electricity, still deeply mysterious in the early 1700s. In 1745, Dutch scientist Peter van Mischenbroek invented the Leyden jar, the first device that could store electrical charge. Before this, electricity could only be generated momentarily through friction and observed in fleeting sparks. The Leyden jar allowed scientists to accumulate and preserve electrical charge, making systematic experimentation possible. Researchers can now study electricity's properties, create larger sparks, explore how it flowed through different materials. This device was a crucial step toward understanding electricity, which would eventually power the modern world. In the 1700s, electricity was still a curiosity, a source of wonder and parlor tricks. But the tools for understanding it were being forged. And as this segment draws to a close, consider one more transformation: the changing relationship between humanity and time itself. Throughout the 1700s, mechanical clocks became increasingly common and accurate. By mid-century, many towns had public clocks, and pocket watches were becoming affordable for the middle classes. This growing precision in timekeeping changed how people organized their lives. Work increasingly began and ended at specific times rather than with sunrise and sunset. Appointments could be made with precision. The working day became standardized in factories, workers punching in and out at specific hours. This time discipline, as historians call it, was essential to the functioning of industrial society. The 1700s marked a shift from agricultural time, governed by seasons and daylight, to industrial time, governed by the clock. Humanity was learning to measure moments with increasing precision, and in doing so, was changing its fundamental relationship with the passage of time. Begin by imagining the night sky as people saw it in the early 1700s. For millennia, humans had observed 5 wandering stars, the planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But in 1781, an amateur astronomer named William Herschel, observing from his garden in England with a telescope he had built himself, noticed something unusual. At first he thought it was a comet, but careful observation revealed it was something far more significant: a new planet, one that had never been recorded in all of human history. This planet would be named Uranus. Herschel's discovery was profound. It meant the solar system was larger than anyone had imagined. For thousands of years, humanity had known of 6 planets, including Earth. Now there were 7. The universe, it seemed, still held surprises. This discovery exemplified the amateur scientific tradition of the 1700s, where passionate individuals could make world-changing observations from their own gardens. Let your mind drift now to the world of political philosophy and the rights of women. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, arguing that women were not naturally inferior to men, but appeared so only because they lacked education and opportunities. She advocated for women's education and for recognizing women as rational beings deserving the same fundamental rights as men. This was a radical argument in the 1700s, when women had few legal rights, could not vote, and were largely excluded from formal education and professional life. Wollstonecraft's work laid philosophical groundwork for feminism, challenging centuries of assumption about gender and capability. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and rights, she argued, should extend to all humans, not just men. Her voice was one of the most powerful, challenging the gender hierarchies of her age. Picture now the lush gardens and greenhouses of Europe, filled with exotic plants from around the world. In 1768, Captain Cook's first voyage carried botanists who collected thousands of plant specimens, including hundreds of species unknown to European science. But plant collection was happening worldwide. The 1700s saw the establishment of botanical gardens in major cities, where exotic plants could be studied and cultivated. These gardens weren't just beautiful. They were centers of scientific research and economic experimentation. Could profitable crops from one part of the world grow elsewhere? Could medicinal plants be cultivated far from their native habitats? The movement of plants around the world, sometimes called a Columbian Exchange when referring to the earlier post-1492 period, accelerated dramatically in the 1700s. Coffee, native to Africa, spread to South America. Tea cultivation expanded. Potatoes from South America became a staple crop in Europe. This botanical globalization would reshape agriculture and diets worldwide. As you relax even more deeply, consider the written records that have allowed us to understand this century so well. In 1709, the first modern copyright law was enacted in England, the Statute of Anne. Before this, Authors had little control over their work once published. Printers could reproduce books freely. The statute of it granted authors ownership of their work for a limited time, giving them control over reproduction and the right to profit from their creations. This legal innovation recognized writing as a form of property and encouraged authorship by making it more financially viable. Throughout the 1700s, the concept of intellectual property began to take shape, acknowledging that ideas and creative works had value in themselves. This was part of the broader shift towards seeing knowledge and creativity as commodities in a market economy. Let us journey now to the world of medicine and the ongoing battle against disease. In 1747, a Scottish surgeon named James Lind conducted what is considered one of the first clinical trials in medical history. Sailors on long voyages often develop scurvy, a devastating disease causing weakness, bleeding gums, and eventually death. Lind took 12 sailors with scurvy and divided them into 6 pairs, giving each pair a different dietary supplement. The pair that received citrus fruits recovered, though it would take decades for the British Navy to implement citrus rations systematically. Lind's experiment demonstrated the power of controlled experimentation in medicine. He showed that careful observation, with proper controls and comparison groups, could reveal the causes and cures of disease. This experimental method, applying scientific principles to medical questions, would gradually transform medicine from an art based on tradition to a science based on evidence. Drift now to the workshops where instruments of precision were being crafted. In the 1700s, the quality of scientific instruments improved dramatically. Microscopes became more powerful and less distorted. Telescopes grew larger and more accurate. Thermometers, barometers, and other measuring devices became standardized and reliable. By 1761, an Englishman named John Harrison, the same person who solved the longitude problem, had created timepieces so accurate they lost only seconds over months of operation. These improvements in instrumentation were crucial to scientific progress. You cannot discover what you cannot measure, and you cannot measure accurately without good instruments. The craftsmen who ground lenses, calibrated scales, and built precise mechanisms were as essential to the scientific revolution as the famous scientists whose names we remember. The 1700s represented a golden age of instrument making, providing researchers with tools worthy of their questions. As you breathe slowly, let us consider the movement of ideas through another medium, music published and shared. By the mid-1700s, music publishing had become a significant industry. Compositions could be printed and distributed widely, allowing music written in one country to be performed in another. Amateur musicians, particularly among the growing middle class, could purchase sheet music and play the latest compositions in their homes. This democratization of music meant that cultural experiences once limited to courts and churches were now accessible to many more people. A shopkeeper in London could play a piece written by a composer in Vienna. Music, like knowledge and literature, was becoming more widely shared, breaking down barriers of geography and class. Now, picture the year 1712 and a remarkable invention that would shape the industrial world. Thomas Newcomen built the first practical steam engine used for pumping water out of mines. Before Newcomen's engine, mines frequently flooded, limiting how deep they could be dug. His invention used steam pressure and atmospheric pressure to drive a piston, which pumped water to the surface. It was inefficient and consumed enormous amounts of coal, but it worked, and it was revolutionary. Mines could now go deeper, extracting more coal and metal ore. This was before James Watt's later improvements, but Newcomen's engine was the crucial first step. It represented humanity's first practical application of steam power for industrial purposes, a breakthrough that would eventually power factories, locomotives, and ships, fundamentally transforming civilization. Let your thoughts wander to the intellectual salons of Paris in the 1770s and 1780s. These were gatherings, often hosted by educated women, where philosophers, scientists, writers, and political figures would meet to discuss ideas. The salon was a unique social institution, less formal than universities or academies, but serious in its intellectual engagement. Ideas about politics, science, art, and society were debated and refined in these conversations. The salons played a crucial role in the Enlightenment, providing spaces where radical ideas could be discussed relatively freely. Women like Madame Geoffrin and Madame du Deffat hosted some of the most influential salons, wielding significant cultural influence even though they were excluded from formal political and academic power. These gatherings show that intellectual life could exist outside official institutions, that conversation and exchange themselves could drive cultural change. And as this segment concludes, consider the changing understanding of Earth itself. In 1785, James Hutton presented his theory of the Earth to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, arguing that the Earth was far older than anyone had previously believed. By studying rock formations and geological processes, Hutton concluded that the planet had been shaped by slow, gradual changes over immense periods of time, mountains rising and eroding, sediments accumulating, rocks forming from heat and pressure. This concept, called deep time, was revolutionary and unsettling. If Earth was millions of years old rather than thousands, it challenged prevailing religious chronologies. Hutton's work laid the foundation for modern geology. He helped humanity understand that the planet beneath our feet has a vast history, that the landscapes we see were shaped by processes operating over timescales almost beyond human comprehension. The 1700s expanded humanity's sense of time, both forward and backward. Forward into the possibilities of progress, backward into the deep past of our planet. Begin by traveling to the year 1755, to the city of Lisbon, Portugal. On the morning of November 1st, All Saints' Day, as churches filled with worshippers, a massive earthquake struck. The tremors lasted for several minutes, collapsing buildings throughout the city. Fires broke out from overturned candles and hearths. Then, about 40 minutes after the earthquake, a tsunami, waves up to 40 feet high, crashed into the harbor, flooding the lower city. An estimated 30,000 to 60,000 people died, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in European history. But the Lisbon earthquake was significant beyond its terrible toll. It sparked intense philosophical debate across Europe. How could a good God allow such destruction, especially on a holy day when people were at prayer? The disaster challenged optimistic Enlightenment beliefs in divine providence and cosmic order. Voltaire wrote his famous satirical novel, Candide, partly in response to this catastrophe. More practically, the Marquis of Pombal, who led Lisbon's reconstruction, sent questionnaires throughout Portugal asking detailed questions about the earthquake's effects, creating one of the first systematic studies of seismic activity. From tragedy came the beginnings of modern seismology and deeper questions about faith, fate, and the nature of existence. Let your thoughts drift now to the world of manufacturing and a simple but transformative innovation. In 1733, John Kay invented the flying shuttle, a device that allowed weavers to work faster and create wider pieces of cloth. Before this invention, weaving cloth on a loom was slow work, and wide fabrics required two weavers working together. Kay's flying shuttle could be operated by one person and dramatically increase productivity. Like the spinning jenny we encountered earlier, this was part of the technological cascade that transformed textile production. But there's an important human story here, too. Textile workers, seeing their livelihoods threatened by machines, sometimes rioted and destroyed the new equipment. Kay himself was attacked by angry weavers and eventually fled to France. The Industrial Revolution brought progress and prosperity to some, but disruption and hardship to others. The 1700s taught us that technological change always creates winners and losers, and the human cost of progress must be acknowledged and addressed. Picture now the year 1783, and one of humanity's oldest dreams finally realized. In France, the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne, launched the first successful human flight. Their hot air balloon, made of paper and fabric, carried passengers into the sky above Paris. For the first time in history, humans had lifted themselves into the air through their own ingenuity rather than imagination. The flights drew enormous crowds, and balloon fever swept across Europe. Within months, balloons were flying in many countries. While these early balloons couldn't be steered reliably and were at the mercy of winds, they proved that human flight was possible. The view from above, seeing landscapes spread out below, clouds at eye level, the curvature of the horizon, gave people a literally new perspective on their world. The age of human flight had begun. Though practical, controlled flight would take another century to achieve. As you breathe slowly and deeply, consider the expansion of empires across the globe during the century. By 1700, European powers had established trading posts and colonies on every inhabited continent. Throughout the century, these colonial holdings expanded dramatically. Britain controlled much of North America and was establishing dominance in India. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas. France had colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and trading posts in Africa and Asia. The Netherlands maintained a trading empire in Southeast Asia. Portugal held territories in Brazil and Africa. These empires brought wealth to European nations but were built through conquest, exploitation, and the displacement of indigenous peoples. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, fought across multiple continents, is sometimes called the First World War because it involved powers fighting not just in Europe but in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. By the end of the 1700s, European imperial control had fundamentally reshaped global politics and economics, creating connections and power imbalances that would influence world history for centuries to come. Let your mind wander now to a simpler innovation that changed daily life in countless households. In 1709, the same year Cristofori invented the piano and Darby revolutionized iron smelting, Meissen in Germany produced the first European hard-paste porcelain. For centuries, Europeans had imported fine porcelain from China at great expense, unable to replicate its formula. Chinese porcelain was prized for its beauty, translucency, and strength. The discovery of how to make true porcelain in Europe broke China's monopoly and made fine dishware more accessible. Within decades, porcelain factories were established across Europe. This was part of a broader pattern in the 1700s, Europeans encountering desirable goods from other parts of the world and either importing them in vast quantities or learning to produce them locally. Tea, coffee, chocolate, cotton fabrics, porcelain, Global trade and cultural exchange were transforming European material culture, bringing new tastes, new fashions, and new domestic comforts. Drift now to the world of mathematics, that abstract realm that nevertheless shapes so much of physical reality. In 1748, the Swiss mathematician Leonhard Euler published Introductio in Analysis Infinitorum, a foundational work in mathematical analysis. Euler was one of history's most prolific mathematicians, making fundamental contributions to geometry, calculus, number theory, and applied mathematics. He introduced much of modern mathematical notation, including the symbol pi for pi and e for the base of natural logarithms. Euler worked even after becoming completely blind in 1766, dictating his mathematical discoveries to assistants. His work in the 1700s helped establish mathematics as a rigorous, systematic discipline and provided tools that would later enable advances in physics and engineering. Mathematics in the 18th century was becoming more abstract, more powerful, and more essential to understanding the physical world. It was a language in which natural laws could be precisely expressed and manipulated. As you relax even more completely, picture the changing nature of communication across distances. In 1775, the British postal system was handling about 4 million letters per year. By 1790, this had nearly doubled. Postal services were expanding and becoming more reliable, creating networks that connected distant places. Letters took weeks or months to cross oceans, but they enabled families separated by migration to stay in touch, businesses to coordinate across distances, and ideas to spread beyond face-to-face conversation. The growth of postal systems, combined with rising literacy rates, meant that more people than ever before could participate in written communication. News, gossip, philosophy, business dealings, expressions of love and friendship all travel along postal routes, connecting humans across the miles. The 1700s was a century when written correspondence became a central part of how society functioned, creating webs of connection invisible but vital. Now, let us turn to a development in agriculture that would have profound consequences: selective breeding and the improvement of livestock. Throughout the 1700s, farmers like Robert Bakewell in England pioneered systematic breeding programs for sheep, cattle, and horses. By carefully selecting which animals to breed based on desired traits, larger size, more meat, better wool, they dramatically improved livestock quality. Bakewell's Leicester sheep, for instance, were bred to produce more meat in less time. This wasn't just important for farmers' profits. It meant more food could be produced from the same amount of land. The average weight of cattle sold at market increased significantly during the century. Combined with improved crop rotation and other agricultural innovations we've discussed, these breeding programs were part of the agricultural revolution that enabled population growth and freed labor for industrial work. Humans were learning to shape nature more deliberately, applying observation and selection to create the characteristics they desired, a forerunner to our modern understanding of genetics. Let your thoughts settle on the ocean voyages that connected continents in this age. The 1700s saw steady improvements in ship design and navigation. Ships became more seaworthy, able to carry larger cargoes more safely. The development of the marine chronometer, which we've already encountered, made navigation more accurate. Charts and maps improved as explorers surveyed coastlines and ocean depths. By the late 1700s, journey times between Europe and Asia had shortened, and the routes were better understood. The British East India Company, The Dutch East India Company and other trading organizations operated fleets of merchant ships connecting Europe with Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These ships carried not just goods but people, colonists, missionaries, officials, soldiers, and enslaved people forced into migration. They also carried ideas, technologies, and diseases. The oceans, which had once been barriers, were becoming highways. The 1700s accelerated the process of making Earth one interconnected world, though that interconnection brought both opportunities and tragedies. And as this segment draws to a close, consider one more aspect of daily life transformed: lighting. For most of human history, night meant darkness broken only by firelight or simple oil lamps. In 1780, a Swiss chemist named Argan invented an oil lamp with a hollow cylindrical wick and glass chimney that produced light far brighter than previous designs, reportedly as bright as 10 traditional lamps. Argan's lamp provided steady, bright illumination for reading and working. Throughout the 1700s, various improvements in lighting technology, better candles, improved oil lamps, more efficient designs, gradually pushed back the darkness. This might seem minor, but it changed how people lived. Work and reading could extend further into the evening. Social gatherings could continue after sunset in well-lit rooms. The useful day was lengthening. Humans were gaining more control over one of nature's most basic rhythms: the cycle of light and darkness. The conquest of night had begun, though it would take another century and the development of gas and electric lighting to complete. Begin by imagining the forests of Europe in the early 1700s, forests that had been carefully managed for centuries. In 1713, a German forester named Hans Carl von Carlowitz published a book called Silvicultura Economica, which introduced the concept of sustainable forestry. He argued that forests should be managed so that they could provide timber indefinitely, that only as much would should be harvested as could regrow. This might seem obvious today, but it was revolutionary then. Von Carlowitz coined the term Nachhaltigkeit, sustainability. His ideas emerged from a real crisis. European forests were being depleted by the demands of shipbuilding, construction, iron smelting, and fuel. The concept that resources should be managed for long-term use rather than short-term extraction was a significant intellectual development. It represented an early recognition that human activities could exhaust nature's bounty, and that foresight and restraint were necessary. The 1700s gave us not just exploitation of resources, but also the first systematic thinking about conservation and sustainable use. Let your thoughts drift now to the world of childhood and a particular invention that brought joy to countless young people. In 1760, the jigsaw puzzle was invented by John Spilsbury, a London engraver and map maker. He mounted maps on wood and cut them into pieces, creating educational tools for teaching geography to children. From this practical beginning emerged a form of entertainment that would spread worldwide. The jigsaw puzzle represented something important about the 1700s, a growing interest in education through play, in making learning enjoyable for children. It was part of the broader Enlightenment interest in pedagogy and human development. But puzzles also reflected the century's love of order, the satisfaction of taking fragments and assembling them into a coherent whole, just as Enlightenment thinkers were trying to assemble knowledge itself into coherent systems. Picture now the year 1764, and a literary innovation that would transform storytelling. Horace Walpole published The Castle of Otranto, generally considered the first Gothic novel. Set in a medieval castle with mysterious supernatural events, the novel introduced elements of horror, romance, and the uncanny that would define the Gothic genre. This was a reaction against the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and order. Gothic literature explored the irrational, the emotional, the mysterious. It suggested that not everything could be explained by reason, that there were dark corners of human experience that defied rational analysis. The popularity of Gothic novels in the late 1700s showed that even in the age of reason, people craved stories that acknowledged fear, superstition, and the unknown. The human imagination needed darkness as well as light, emotion as well as reason. As you breathe slowly and deeply, consider the development of public museums in the 1700s. In 1759, the British Museum opened to the public in London, one of the first major museums accessible to ordinary citizens rather than just scholars or the wealthy. Founded on the collection of physician Hans Sloane, it contained books, manuscripts, natural history specimens, and antiquities from around the world. The idea that cultural and scientific treasures should be available for public education and enjoyment was a powerful democratic principle. Throughout the century, similar institutions emerged across Europe. Museums represented the Enlightenment belief that knowledge should be shared, that everyone could benefit from exposure to art, science, and history. They were temples to learning, open to all who wished to enter. The 1700s created the institutional infrastructure for mass education and cultural enrichment. Drift now to the workshops of precision craftsmen, where beautiful and intricate objects were being created. The 1700s were a golden age for furniture making, with styles like Queen and Chippendale, and Louis XV representing the highest achievements of the cabinet maker's art. Artisans created pieces of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. Chairs, tables, cabinets decorated with marquetry, carving, and gilding. But these weren't just decorative. They reflected deep knowledge of materials, joinery, and design. A master furniture maker understood wood's properties, how different species behave, how joints would be strong yet elegant. This expertise was passed from master to apprentice through years of training. The 1700s celebrated this kind of skilled handwork, even as the beginning of industrialization threatened to make such craftsmanship less economically viable. There was a beauty in objects made by human hands with traditional skills, a quality that machines would struggle to replicate. Let your mind wander to the world of exploration and cartography. Throughout the 1700s, maps became increasingly accurate and detailed. James Cook's voyages in the Pacific in the 1760s and 1770s produced the first accurate charts of New Zealand, Australia's east coast, and numerous Pacific islands. French explorers mapped other regions. Russia sent expeditions across Siberia to Alaska. By the end of the century, the basic outline of all continents, except Antarctica, was known to European cartographers. The interiors of continents, especially Africa and Australia, remained largely unmapped, but the coastlines were increasingly well documented. These maps were tools of knowledge, but also tools of power. Accurately mapping a region was often the first step toward controlling it. The 1700s was a century when Earth's geography was systematically recorded, when the planet's true size and shape became known. The age of exploration was filling in the blank spaces on maps, for better and worse. As you relax even more completely, picture the year 1787 and a social innovation that would have profound implications. In Britain, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded, bringing together Quakers and other activists who believed slavery was morally wrong. They organized petitions, distributed pamphlets, and campaigned tirelessly to end the slave trade. Former enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano published autobiographies detailing slavery's horrors, giving personal testimony that moved many readers. This was one of the first major social reform movements organized through public campaigns, petitions, and media. While the British slave trade wouldn't be abolished until 1807, and slavery itself persisted longer, the abolitionist movement that gained momentum in the late 1700s represented something new: organized citizens demanding political change based on moral principles, using the tools of print, public speaking, and organized pressure. It showed that public opinion could be mobilized and that moral arguments could translate into political action. Now, let's turn to an innovation in food preservation that would have far-reaching effects. Throughout the 1700s, various methods of preserving food improved. Canning wouldn't be invented until 1809, but techniques like salting, smoking, pickling, and dry became more refined and systematic. The British Royal Navy experimented extensively with ways to keep food edible during long voyages. In 1795, the first preserved meat was put into barrels using a brine solution that kept it from spoiling for extended periods. The ability to preserve food meant that cities could grow larger, fed by agricultural surplus that could be stored and transported. It meant that armies and navies could undertake longer campaigns and voyages. It reduced the fear of winter famine that had haunted humans for millennia. Food preservation technology was unglamorous but essential. It changed the basic equation of human survival, making populations less vulnerable to seasonal variation and food scarcity. Let your thoughts settle on the world of medicine and an observation that would save countless mothers and infants. In the 1770s and 1780s, physicians began to notice a disturbing pattern. Women who gave birth in hospitals, particularly in charity hospitals where medical students trained, died of childbed fever at much higher rates than women who gave birth at home. Though the full explanation that doctors are carrying infectious matter from autopsies to birthing wards wouldn't be understood until the next century, some practitioners began to notice the connection. This observation represented a growing tendency in medicine to collect statistics, to notice patterns, to ask why outcomes differed in different circumstances. The 1700s saw medicine slowly becoming more empirical, more willing to question established practices, and learn from systematic observation. The scientific method was gradually infiltrating the healing arts, though much suffering would occur before its full application transformed medical practice. And as this segment concludes, consider the changing nature of childhood itself in the 1700s. Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Rousseau argued that children were not simply small adults, but had their own nature and needs. This view, though not universally accepted or applied, began to influence how some families raise their children. Childhood was increasingly seen as a distinct life stage requiring special attention and education. Children's books began to be published, not just religious instruction, but stories meant to entertain and educate young readers. Toys designed specifically for children became more common. Of course, this applied mainly to middle and upper-class families. Poor children still worked from an early age, and the factory system would make child labor more common in the next century. But the idea that childhood should be a time of learning and play, protected from adult burdens, was taking root in this era. The 1700s gave us early versions of modern attitudes toward children and child-rearing, though the full realization of these ideals would take generations more. Begin by considering a simple question that perplexed the greatest minds. What is heat? Throughout the 1700s, most scientists believed in the caloric theory, that heat was an invisible fluid called caloric that flowed from hot objects to cold ones. In the 1790s, an American-born British physicist named Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, conducted experiments while supervising the boring of cannons in Bavaria. He noticed that the drilling generated seemingly endless amounts of heat, far more than could be explained by caloric being released from the metal. Rumford concluded that heat was not a substance but a form of motion. That friction created heat by causing particles to move faster. Though his ideas weren't immediately accepted, they were an important step toward the modern understanding of heat as energy. This represents how science progresses in the 1700s. Through careful observation, clever experiments, and a willingness to question even well-established theories. Understanding heat would prove essential to the further development of steam engines and the entire field of thermodynamics. Let your thoughts float now to the world of agriculture and a crop that changed diets across a continent. The potato, introduced to Europe from South America in the 1500s, was initially viewed with suspicion. Some believed it caused disease or was food fit only for animals. But in the 1700s, particularly in Ireland and parts of Germany and France, the potato became a staple crop. It could produce far more calories per acre than grain crops, grew in poor soil, and required less labor to cultivate. In Prussia, Frederick the Great actively promoted potato cultivation, even distributing free seed potatoes and posting soldiers to guard potato fields to make them seem valuable. By the late 1700s, potatoes were feeding millions, supporting population growth, and changing European cuisine. This humble tuber from the Andes became one of the world's most important foods, demonstrating how crops could cross oceans and transform societies far from their origins. Picture now the year 1774, and a discovery that would revolutionize chemistry and our understanding of life itself. Joseph Priestley in England isolated a gas he called dephlogisticated air by heating mercury oxide. Independently, Carl Wilhelm Scheele in Sweden had made a similar discovery slightly earlier. The gas they had discovered was oxygen, though they didn't fully understand what they had found. Antoine Lavoisier in France recognized that this gas was essential to both combustion and respiration, that we breathe oxygen, and that it sustains both fire and life. This discovery fundamentally changed how scientists understood breathing, burning, and metabolism. The air we breathe wasn't just one substance, but a mixture of gases, each with distinct properties. Oxygen was the key to life, the element that allowed our bodies to extract energy from food. This discovery in the 1700s opened the door to understanding the chemistry of life itself. As you breathe slowly and deeply, breathing that oxygen they discovered. Consider the world of timekeeping and how it was becoming ever more precise. In 1721, George Graham invented the mercury pendulum, which compensated for temperature changes that would otherwise make clocks run faster or slower. As mercury expanded with heat, it moved upward, keeping the pendulum center of mass constant. This was one of many refinements in the 1700s that made clocks extraordinarily accurate. Public clocks began to have minute hands, as well as hour hands, reflecting this improved precision. The standardization of time was becoming essential as society grew more complex, as factories needed to coordinate workers, as trains would eventually need to run on schedules. The 1700s was when humanity began to measure time with the precision that modern life requires, when minutes and seconds became meaningful units of daily experience rather than abstract divisions used only by astronomers. Drift now to the royal courts and grand estates, where landscape design was becoming an art form. In England, landscape architects like Capability Brown transformed formal geometric gardens into naturalistic parks with rolling lawns, carefully placed clumps of trees, and serpentine lakes. This English landscape garden style, which became fashionable in the mid-1700s, was meant to look natural but was actually carefully designed and sculpted. It reflected Enlightenment aesthetics, a preference for nature, or at least an idealized version of it, over rigid formality. These landscape gardens were expensive luxuries available only to the wealthy, but they represented changing attitudes toward nature itself. Rather than taming nature into geometric submission, these gardens celebrated, artificially created natural beauty. The relationship between humanity and the natural world was being reimagined in many ways during the 1700s, from scientific taxonomy to aesthetic appreciation. Let your mind wander to a medical practice that was both common and controversial in the 1700s: bloodletting. Physicians believed that many diseases were caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and that draining blood could restore balance and health. It's remarkable to consider that this practice, which we now know is usually harmful, was the standard treatment for everything from fever to inflammation. George Washington, at the end of the century in 1799, was likely hastened to his death by aggressive bloodletting during his final illness. Yet physicians practiced bloodletting with genuine belief in its efficacy, based on centuries of medical tradition and seemingly supportive observations. This reminds us that the 1700s was a transitional time in medicine. Empirical observation was beginning to matter more, but traditional beliefs still dominated. The path from ancient medical theories to modern evidence-based medicine would take more than 1 century to complete. As you relax even more deeply, picture the world of communication and a technological innovation that expanded human connection. In 1792, Claude Chappe in France invented the semaphore telegraph, a system of towers with movable arms that could relay messages across long distances by visual signals. Operators would set the arms in different positions representing letters or words, and observers at the next tower would read the signal through telescopes and relay it onward. A message could travel from Paris to the French coast in minutes, rather than the days a horseback courier would require. Napoleon would use this system extensively for military communication. The semaphore telegraph was a forerunner of electronic telegraphy and represented humanity's eternal desire to communicate faster across distance. In the 1700s, distance was still measured in days of travel, but innovations like the semaphore showed that communication could outpace physical transportation, that messages could fly faster than horses could gallop. Now, let us turn to the built environment and an innovation in construction. In 1779, the world's first cast iron bridge was completed at Coalbrookdale in England. Spanning the River Severn, it demonstrated that iron could be used for major structural elements, not just tools and machines. The bridge still stands today, a testament to the durability of iron construction. This pioneering structure showed that the Industrial Revolution's materials could transform not just manufacturing but architecture and civil engineering. In the centuries that followed, iron and later steel would make possible bridges spanning vast distances, buildings rising to unprecedented heights, and infrastructure supporting modern cities. The Iron Bridge at Coalbrookdale was a herald of this future, a demonstration that the age of stone and wood construction was giving way to an age of metal. Let your thoughts settle on the world of exploration and a particularly difficult environment that humans were beginning to penetrate. In the late 1700s, explorers and fur traders pushed into the interior of North America, into the vast boreal forests and tundra of Canada. They encountered harsh climates, navigated complex river systems, and established trading relationships with indigenous peoples who had inhabited these lands for millennia. The fur trade, particularly beaver pelts for making fashionable hats, drove this exploration. Trading posts were established deeper and deeper into the wilderness. Maps were gradually filled in with the rivers, lakes, and mountains of the continent's interior. This expansion brought economic opportunities, but also devastating changes for indigenous populations, disease, disruption of traditional ways of life, and the beginning of ecological changes as animal populations were hunted intensively. The exploration of North America in the 1700s was simultaneously an expansion of geographical knowledge and the leading edge of colonialism's destructive impact. And as this segment draws to a close, consider the world of mathematics and a problem that fascinated scholars. Can you cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg exactly once without retracing your steps? In 1736, the mathematician Leonhard Euler proved that it was impossible, but more importantly, his solution created a new branch of mathematics called graph theory. Euler realized that the specific geography didn't matter, only the abstract relationships between land masses and bridges. He was thinking about space in a new way, focusing on connections and relationships rather than distances and angles. Graph theory would eventually become essential to computer science, network analysis, and countless other fields. It's remarkable that a playful puzzle about bridges in a Prussian city could lead to such profound mathematical insights. The 1700s showed repeatedly that abstract thinking, pure curiosity, and intellectual play could lead to ideas with immense practical significance, even if that significance wasn't apparent for generations. Begin by considering the power of words to inspire action. In 1791 and 1792, Thomas Paine published Rights of Man, a defense of the French Revolution, and a powerful argument for human rights, democracy, and social welfare. Paine argued that government's purpose was to serve the people, that poverty could be addressed through social programs, and that hereditary monarchy was unjust. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies across Europe and America, making it one of the most influential political texts of the era. Paine was eventually forced to flee England to avoid prosecution for seditious writings. His words were considered dangerous because they were persuasive, because they challenged the foundations of aristocratic society. The 1700s demonstrated that ideas could be as revolutionary as armies, that the written word could topple thrones and reshape societies. Paine's work embodied the radical edge of Enlightenment thought, the belief that human reason and justice should determine how we govern ourselves. Let your mind drift now to the world of fabric and fashion. In 1793, an American named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, a machine that could rapidly separate cotton fibers from their seeds. Before this invention, removing seeds was laborious handwork. A person might clean only a pound of cotton in a day. Whitney's gin could process 50 pounds in the same time. This dramatically increased cotton production and made cotton cloth more affordable and accessible. Cotton cultivation expanded enormously in the American South. transforming the region's economy. But this seemingly beneficial innovation had a terrible consequence. It made slavery more profitable, leading to its expansion and entrenchment. The cotton gin is a stark reminder that technological progress can have deeply troubling moral implications, that innovation can serve injustice as well as human welfare. The 1700s taught us that the consequences of our inventions are not always what we intend or hope for. Picture now the year 1735 and think of the immense collaborative project of measurement undertaken across oceans. We've mentioned the French expeditions to measure Earth's shape, but consider the human effort involved. Scientists spending years in remote locations, carrying delicate instruments through jungles and over mountains, making thousands of careful observations, all to answer a question about Earth's geometry. One expedition member died of fever in South America. Others endured incredible hardship. This dedication represented the Enlightenment conviction that knowledge was worth pursuing even at great personal cost. Science in the 1700s required not just brilliant minds, but also physical courage, endurance, and commitment. The expeditions to measure a degree of latitude were adventures as much as experiments, journeys that expanded human knowledge while testing human limits. As you breathe slowly and deeply, consider the emergence of economics as a distinct field of study. Beyond Adam Smith, whom we've already discussed, other thinkers in the 1700s were trying to understand how economies functioned. The physiocrats in France argued that agriculture was the source of all wealth. Others explored the nature of money, trade, and labor. In 1705, John Law proposed paper money backed by land value. Implementing his ideas in France were initially spectacular, but ultimately disastrous results, an early lesson in monetary policy and financial speculation. The 1700s was when people began to think systematically about economic systems, to see them as following certain principles that could be studied and understood. This intellectual development was as significant as the economic changes themselves, giving us frameworks for analyzing prosperity, poverty, trade, and the organization of productive activity. Drift now to the streets of major cities, where a new form of urban life was emerging. Kaffa houses, which we've mentioned before, were joined by other public spaces, pleasure gardens, theaters, taverns, assembly rooms. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, and other cities, a vibrant public culture developed. People from different social classes, though still mostly men and mostly not the poorest, could gather, discuss, debate, and socialize in these spaces. News circulated through coffee houses. Political opinions were formed and expressed. Commercial deals were made. This public sphere, as historians call it, was essential to the political and intellectual ferment of the age. Ideas that would fuel revolutions were discussed over coffee and wine. The 1700s created spaces where civil society could exist outside of church, state, and family, where individuals could participate in civic life and cultural exchange. Let your thoughts settle on the world of astronomy and a woman who made remarkable contributions despite facing enormous obstacles. Caroline Herschel, sister of William Herschel, who discovered Uranus, became an accomplished astronomer in her own right. In the 1780s and 1790s, she discovered several comets and compiled catalogs of nebulae and star clusters. She was the first woman to be paid for scientific work in England and the first woman to be awarded a gold medal by the Royal Astronomical Society, though this honor came in the 1800s. Caroline's achievements were extraordinary given the barriers women faced in pursuing science. Most women in the 1700s had little access to education, especially in mathematics and science, and were excluded from universities and scientific societies. Yet some exceptional women, like Caroline Herschel, managed to contribute to scientific knowledge despite these obstacles, pointing toward a future when such contributions will be more recognized and valued. As you relax even more completely, picture the development of insurance as a systematic business in the 1700s. Fire insurance companies emerged, offering to compensate property owners if their buildings burned. Marine insurance protected merchants against loss of ships and cargo. Life insurance began to be offered based on actuarial tables that predicted life expectancy. In 1706, the first insurance company for marine insurance was established in London. These institutions represented a new way of managing risk, pooling resources so that individual losses could be absorbed by the collective. Insurance was based on probability and statistics, on the ability to predict aggregate outcomes even when individual outcomes were uncertain. It was another example of the 1700s applying mathematical and rational thinking to practical problems, creating institutions that made commercial society more stable and predictable. Now, let us turn to the world of exploration in the Pacific Ocean, which was being systematically charted for the first time. James Cook's 3 voyages between 1768 and 1779 transformed European knowledge of the Pacific. He circumnavigated New Zealand, proving it was islands rather than part of a larger continent. He mapped Australia's eastern coast. He explored the Pacific, visiting countless islands, some known to Europeans, many not. He crossed the Antarctic Circle, searching for the fabled southern continent. Cook was a masterful navigator and cartographer, but his voyages also brought European contact and European diseases to island populations that had been isolated. He was killed in Hawaii in 1779 in a conflict with native Hawaiians. Cook's voyages epitomize both the achievement and the tragedy of exploration in this era, expanding human knowledge while also beginning the disruption of indigenous societies. Let your mind wander to the realm of public health and an innovation that would save countless lives. In the 1790s, Edward Jenner's work on vaccination began to spread beyond England. Though initially met with skepticism and even opposition, some clergy preached that vaccination was against God's will, and some physicians were reluctant to accept such a simple solution. The practice gradually gained acceptance as its effectiveness became undeniable. By the end of the 1790s, vaccination was being performed across Europe and in America. The idea that a disease could be prevented rather than merely treated was revolutionary. For the first time, humanity had a tool that could actually stop a major killer disease from spreading. This represented a fundamental shift in medicine's possibilities, from passive response to active prevention, from helplessness before epidemics to the power to halt them. And as this segment concludes, consider one final aspect of daily life transformed in the 1700s, the availability of mirrors. Earlier centuries had only small, expensive mirrors made from polished metal or glass with metallic backing. In the 1700s, improvements in glassmaking and silvering techniques made larger, clearer, more affordable mirrors possible. More households could have mirrors, allowing people to see themselves clearly for the first time. This might seem trivial, but it had psychological and cultural effects. Self-awareness, self-presentation, fashion, all were influenced by the ability to see one's own image clearly. The famous Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, completed in 1684, but epitomizing the Baroque aesthetic that continued into the early 1700s, showed mirrors as symbols of wealth and power. By the end of the century, mirrors were becoming more democratically available, allowing more people to literally see themselves with new clarity. Begin by considering the written constitutions that emerged in this revolutionary age. In 1787, the United States Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia, creating a framework for government based on Enlightenment principles: separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and rights protected from government interference. This wasn't just a legal document. It was a practical application of political philosophy, an attempt to build a government on reason rather than tradition. The Constitution established that political authority came from we the people rather than divine right or hereditary succession. While flawed, it initially allowed slavery and excluded women and non-property owners from full participation. It represented a new model for how societies could organize themselves. The idea that a government could be deliberately designed, written down, and amended through democratic process was revolutionary. The 1700s gave us the blueprint for modern constitutional democracy. Let your thoughts drift now to the world of music and an innovation in notation and performance. In the 1700s, the symphony emerged as a major musical form. Composers like Haydn wrote over 100 symphonies, establishing the four-movement structure that would become standard. These works were written for orchestras that were growing in size and sophistication, with distinct sections of strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. Public concerts became more common, allowing middle-class audiences to experience orchestral music that had previously been preserved of aristocratic courts. The symphony represented music becoming more complex, more emotionally expressive, and more accessible to wider audiences. By the end of the 1700s, with composers like Mozart and the young Beethoven, the symphony had become one of the highest expressions of Western musical art. Picture now the year 1798, and a book that would cast a long shadow over the future. Thomas Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, arguing that population tends to grow faster than food production, inevitably leading to famine, disease, and conflict. While Malthus's predictions proved too pessimistic, he didn't foresee the agricultural and technological innovations that will allow food production to increase dramatically. His work raised important questions about resources, population, and sustainability. It influenced economic thought, political policy, and even inspired Darwin's theory of natural selection. Malthus represented the more anxious side of Enlightenment thinking, the recognition that progress wasn't guaranteed, that human societies faced real constraints and challenges. The 1700s ended with both optimism about human potential and awareness of the difficulties ahead. As you breathe slowly and deeply, consider the transformation in how people thought about race and human difference. Throughout most of the 1700s, growing contact between peoples of different continents led to attempts at classification. Unfortunately, these classifications often served to justify slavery, colonialism, and inequality. Thinkers created hierarchies of human races, claiming differences in intelligence or capability. These racist pseudoscientific theories would have terrible consequences in centuries to come. Yet the 1700s also saw dissenting voices, the Quakers and other abolitionists who argued that all humans were equal before God, philosophers who questioned racial hierarchies, and the lived experience of multiracial societies that contradicted racist theories. The century's legacy on race is deeply troubled, establishing patterns of thought that would enable immense injustice, even as it also planted seeds of the universal human rights thinking that would eventually challenge those injustices. Drift now to the world of chemistry and the careful work of identifying and naming the elements. By the end of the 1700s, chemists had identified and isolated numerous chemical elements: oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and many metals and other substances. Lavoisier's systematic approach to naming chemicals brought order to what had been chaos. The ancient belief that everything was made of earth, air, fire, and water was definitively replaced by the understanding that matter consisted of distinct elements that combined in specific proportions. The periodic table wouldn't be organized until the next century, but the 1700s laid the groundwork, identifying the building blocks of matter, learning to isolate and study them, recognizing patterns and how they combined. Chemistry was becoming a mature science, with shared language, systematic methods, and cumulative knowledge. Let your mind settle on the changing nature of warfare. In the 1700s, armies became more professional, with soldiers in uniform serving for extended periods rather than being raised temporarily for campaigns. Military tactics became more sophisticated, with greater emphasis on training, discipline, and coordinated maneuvers. Artillery improved, with better cannons and more accurate targeting. Naval warfare was transformed by better ship design and navigation. The 7 Years' War demonstrated how conflicts could span the globe, yet warfare remained brutal and destructive, with soldiers and civilians suffering terribly. The 1700s also saw the beginning of international laws of war, ideas about legitimate conduct in conflict, treatment of prisoners, and distinctions between combatants and civilians. These ideas wouldn't be fully codified until later, but the century began grappling with how to make even warfare more humane and regulated. As you relax into the deepest calm, picture the world of natural philosophy, what we now call science, becoming more institutionalized. Scientific societies like the Royal Society in London and the French Academy of Sciences sponsored research, published findings, and provided forums for scientific exchange. Universities began to include more science in their curricula. Scientific instruments became more available. The idea of the professional scientist, someone whose primary occupation was research and discovery, was beginning to emerge, though most 1700 scientists still pursued science alongside other careers. The infrastructure for modern science was being built: journals for publication, societies for collaboration, standards for evidence and experimentation. Science was becoming a collective, cumulative enterprise rather than the work of isolated individuals. Now, consider the legacy of the 1700s for global power dynamics. At the century's beginning, the Ottoman Empire, China's Qing dynasty, the Mughal Empire in India, and various European powers all controlled significant territories and populations. By the century's end, European powers, particularly Britain and France, had gained unprecedented global influence through colonialism, trade, and technological advantages. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain, would give European powers even greater military and economic advantages in the next century. The 1700s was a pivot point when global power began shifting decisively toward Europe, with consequences that would shape world history for centuries. This shift involved exploitation, violence, and the imposition of European systems on other peoples, creating inequalities and resentments that persist today. Let your thoughts embrace the story of human health in the 1700s. Despite medical advances, life remained precarious for most people. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Life expectancy at birth was probably around 35 to 40 years, though those who survived childhood often lived much longer. Disease, particularly infectious disease, was a great killer. Yet by the end of the century, with vaccination, improved sanitation in some cities, better nutrition from agricultural improvements, and growing medical knowledge, the foundations were being laid for the dramatic increases in life expectancy that would come in the next 2 centuries. The 1700s didn't solve the problem of human mortality, but began to chip away at some of its causes. And finally, as our journey through the 1700s concludes, consider what this century meant for human consciousness itself. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, observation, and evidence began to change how people understood reality. Superstition and tradition remained powerful, but they were increasingly challenged by scientific explanations. The idea that humans could understand nature's laws and improve their conditions through knowledge and effort became more widespread. Individual rights and human dignity gained philosophical support. The possibility of progress, not just in technology but in society, government, and human welfare, became thinkable in new ways. The 1700s didn't create the modern world, but it made that world possible. It was a century of foundations being laid, of ideas being planted, of possibilities being glimpsed. The world that emerged from the 1700s was poised for the dramatic transformations of the industrial, democratic, and scientific revolutions that would follow. Rest now, peacefully and completely. 100 facts have woven together to tell the story of a century when humanity began to wake up to its own potential, when knowledge expanded, when old certainties were questioned, when new possibilities emerged. The 1700s were neither entirely good nor entirely bad, neither purely progressive nor simply exploitative. They were deeply human, full of brilliance and folly, compassion and cruelty, discovery and destruction. Let these stories settle gently in your mind like snow falling softly on a winter evening. Let your breathing slow even further. Let your body sink deeper into comfort. The 1700s are behind us now, their legacy woven into everything we are and everything we might become.